I believe the demonstration here does all the talking. It's a unique take on shmups. The characters have psychic powers in the not-so-distant future. This setting reminds me of something. But there's another aesthetic feature here that separates this from the rest. This is the first time Cave implemented pre-rendered graphics. If you ever played Donkey Kong Country, or looked at the backgrounds during the PlayStation era of Final Fantasy or Resident Evil, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Somehow, the sprites are more detailed than Dodonpachi, as this was the intention of the art director, Junya Inoue. His goal was to invoke a scaled-down premise than the previous titles, and have more of a real-life setting with cityscapes and human characters. As far as the gameplay goes, each character has a different shot pattern known as Psychic Fire, ranging from focused, ranged, and somewhere in between. However, characters also have the piercing cannon shot at their disposal, which has a few purposes. It's a slightly stronger attack, enemies destroyed by it drop power-ups, but when you're fully powered up, this is meant as a scoring mechanic. This isn't something I personally worried about because I'm just trying to survive, but this is essential for experts attempting high scores, and unfortunately, this process is a bit convoluted, and that's pretty well known in the shmup fandom. And finally, you have ESP Drive. This is similar to the bomb mechanic in Dodonpachi, however, the difference is you can actually charge this attack, creating a shield in the process that absorbs projectiles, turning them into power-ups or extra points. When you finally release the button, a powerful attack wipes out your enemies. Each character has a set level progression, so depending what character you choose, that will dictate what level you start on. Something I picked up on after starting the game is that there are a lot of bullets for the first stage. You can even say that Esperade seems a bit difficult. However, there are two mechanics that accommodates this. There was the previously mentioned ESP Drive that absorbs projectiles, and you have 3 hearts indicated in the upper left corner. Getting hit removes a heart, and as you can guess, when you're all out, it's time to pay up. When you do inevitably die, you'll notice that you can't select a different character. If you're familiar with past Cave titles, you know that this is a first for the franchise. Personally, I don't see this as a con. I believe the intention was to make each character have a personalized journey. For instance, each character has different opening animations when the game starts, which indicates they all have different reasons to fight. As I continued on, I realized that I'm actually noticing the enemy designs. In Dodonpachi, I'm shooting multiple types of spacecrafts, and sure, they have different shapes and patterns, but they're all, more or less, spacecrafts. But the enemies here seem to stand out to me much more. The psychics, the mechs, the aircrafts. This is just my opinion, but it feels like there was more design variety than Cave's previous iterations. Another thing that came to mind is that these stages feel lived in. It's not just a battlefield for moving targets. The shopping mall is my favorite stage. It oozes with Akira and Blade Runner aesthetics. And in my opinion, this era between the 80s and the 90s was peak for the cyberpunk setting in media. And what I mean is, despite the technological advancements, there's still this realistic and grounded nature in the environment, where neon is an element of the setting and not an oversaturated feature.
Why does your jacket collar have the same RGB lighting as my desktop build? God, that looks so stupid!
This scope and world design is one of Inoue's distinct specialties, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll touch on this later. Each character experiences these first 3 stages in a different order, but past that is a set level progression. And as you can expect, the more you progress, the more bullets fill the screen. Before you face the final boss, you actually enter her mansion filled with unsettling doll-like girls. Creepy. Eventually, you reach the antagonist, Lady Gara, and man, she has quite a few phases. Interestingly enough, despite how crazy these patterns are and how difficult this fight is, I did find myself actually dodging some of these patterns. I still died often, but for my first attempt, I felt like I held up on my own. But that's something I noticed with Esperade, and I realize you can say this about anything when you have enough practice, but I could feel myself getting better the more I played. Maybe the bullet patterns were easier to read? Don't quote me on this though, that's just my personal takeaway. Once you defeat Lady Gara, a short ending sequence plays out, and to be honest, there isn't much context to these scenes, and that's it. That's the end of the game. No second loop. And to be frank, I prefer this. I think second loops artificially extends the game longer than it has to be. And if you count the original arcade releases, that practice was clearly designed for quarter-munching purposes. I much prefer being rewarded with a secret final boss immediately after you finish the last stage, if you meet score requirements or 1cc the game. You know, the funny thing is that for previous titles I covered, I paused the game when writing notes, discussing pacing or other small quirks, but I was so invested in Esperate I legitimately forgot to do so on my first run. But honestly, I think that's just an indication of how good this title is. It has a good pace, and levels do not drag. And the difficulty progression is a steady incline. It's nothing crazy. It doesn't start out easy and then all of a sudden slams the gas on difficulty. And granted, this game is more challenging than Danpachi and Dodonpachi, for the first loops at least. But like Dodonpachi, even though it's difficult, if you die, it's most likely your fault. Now when it comes to story, I know that the gameplay shows vague notions of a plot. As stated earlier, each character starts out with different introductions. In between levels, there's dialogue shown, but this dialogue is the same regardless what character you're playing. And the ending cinematic is very quick and doesn't really explain a lot. And to be clear, this is fine. This is an arcade game. No one expects Dostoevskian themes in a coin-operated arcade title. But lore does exist outside of this game. I'd also like to point out that this game was made in 1998, so when it talks about the quote-unquote distant future of Tokyo 2018, I guess this is their interpretation of 2018. But basically, it's so overpopulated that engineers have developed an artificial island called Tokyo 2. This was funded by a shady company known as Google. Yakuza. Yakuza is controlled by Lady Gara. Another thing to note within this world, suspiciously, humans being born with the gift of ESP has been increasing, but are hunted down by government ops. Lady Gara also has ESP, but this is kept a secret, as well as her plan to replace every human being with clones of 10-year-old psychic girls that originated from Gara's DNA. Don't ask me for what purpose. Yes, it's creepy and weird. Bad guy doing bad guy things, I guess. Where the main characters come in is based on their ties with the Yakuza Corporation. Yusuke's school was attacked by Yakuza's private military. One of Yusuke's friends was killed by a commander of psychic users, or espers. He's actually the boss fight in this stage. He intentionally shapeshifts into Yusuke's friend in order to provoke him. JB Fifth is a trained Russian psychic assassin. What a mouthful. His mission is to prevent the Yakuza Corporation from growing, which means terminating every prominent figure of the organization, including Lady Gara. When you start out as him, he assassinates a Yakuza general, but because it was seen, JB is now on the run from Yakuza and the police. Iori is the daughter of an aristocratic family that leads an anti-Yakuza group. She was always aware of her powers, but was raised to use it responsibly. Lady Gara found out and saw this as a threat, and sent the Yakuza organization to assassinate her. Her parents were killed during her escape. Now, if a few of you are wondering why this world design seems incredibly elaborate for a shmup title, we can thank the lead designer Junya Inoue, a man who wore many hats, one of those hats being a manga artist, other than just a game designer. I truly believe it's thanks to this man that Cave titles have such a strong impact in its presentation. It's thanks to this art direction that gave Cave a broader appeal to the market at its time of release. Before Cave even existed, Inoue worked for a company known as Topolon. This is where he met Tsuneki Ikeda. Sadly, Topolon went out of business and closed its doors, but Ikeda started a new arcade company, a little old business known as Cave. Ikeda offered a position to Inoue, but he also had an offer to work with Rising. But due to the solid work relationship, Inoue stuck with Ikeda. After working on Dodonpachi, Inoue expressed his frustrations with the lack of innovation. In a 2010 Arcadia magazine interview, Ikeda reflects on this moment and states, "Midway through the development of Dodonpachi, Inoue joined Cave. He only had a small part in its development, but later, in typical Inoue fashion, he was very critical of the setting of Dodonpachi. This colorful world of mechas is ridiculous." For our next game, Inoue was assigned as the graphic leader, and he said, "Since I'm doing this game, I want there to be characters. Enough with the fighter jets." So he created humanoid player characters and an STG that took place in a more realistic world. The battles take place in schools, streets, etc. He wanted it to feel like a world people actually inhabited in. Even after all the titles Inoue worked on, he still continued to feel that creative restraint in game design, mainly because his worlds couldn't be expanded into the depth he wanted. After a few more titles, Inoue left Cave to focus on his passion for manga. I assume his relationship with Cave was still pretty solid, because he came back for Death Smiles and a few other titles after that. Overall, it's clear that S-Braid was a pinnacle moment in Cave's history. It was very popular in Japanese arcades. Despite the aging hardware of the Cave 68000 arcade board, they were able to push it to its limits and create a graphically lush title. However, it's not like this title is perfect. Despite what I like about the game, the scoring system is incredibly convoluted and flawed. This isn't something I mind currently because I'm a complete amateur. But if you want to really take S-Braid competitively, you'll want to pick up S-Braid Sai, the only arcade port of this game with quality of life improvements, extra content, and more importantly, a more comprehensive scoring system. Currently, as I'm recording this, the PS4 version is roughly between $60 to $70, and the Switch version just wants to hang out around $110 for some reason, clearly a steep difference. However, emulating this is pretty cost effective. But if you have to physically own it, having a PS4 is easier and more affordable than a Mister, and owning a Mister is easier and more affordable than owning the original arcade board. You know, as I was doing research for all these Cave titles and going through the series, I was banking on S-Braid to be my favorite of the 90s era arcade titles. And there is a lot to like, but their next title gave me a different perspective.